Without the Soviets to worry about, NATO needed a mission in stopping the evil Serbs fit the bill. It was convenient to ignore the evil Croats and the Kosovars, and it certainly was easy to forget the United Nations, NATO's, and the United States' policies over the past decade that contributed to the mess in Yugoslavia. It was soon apparent that bombing was no more a successful diplomatic tool than were the threats of dire consequences if the treaty, unfavorable to the Serbs, was not quickly signed by Milosevic. This drew demands that policy must be directed toward saving NATO by expanding the war. NATO's credibility was now at stake, and how could Europe and the United States war machine survive if NATO were to disintegrate? Hopes, as expressed by Ron Brown and his corporate friends, were not extinguished by the unfortunate and mysterious Air Force crash while on their way to Bosnia to do business deals. Nobody even bothers to find out what U.S. policy condones business trips of our corporate leaders in a war zone on an Air Force aircraft. Corporate interest in the military-industrial complex continues to play a role in our Yugoslavian war policy. Corporate America loves NATO. Most politicians and the public do not know what NATO's real mission is, and today's policy cannot be explained by reading its mission statement written in 1949. Certainly, our vital interests and national security cannot justify our escalation of the war in Yugoslavia. The excuse that we're the only superpower is hardly a moral reason to justify bombing nations that are seen as uncooperative. Military strength gives neither a right to bully nor a monopoly on wisdom. This strength, too often when held by large political entities, is used criminally to serve the powerful special interests. The Persian Gulf and Yugoslavia obviously are much more economically intriguing than Rwanda and the Sudan. There are clearly no business benefits for taking on the Chinese over its policy toward Tibet. Quite the contrary, we do business with China and subsidize her to boot. In spite of the powerful political and industrial leaders' support behind NATO and the budgets of 19 Western countries, NATO's days appear numbered. And we shall not weep when NATO goes the way of the Soviet Empire and the Warsaw Pact. Managing a war with 19 vetoes makes it impossible for a coherent strategy to evolve. Chaos, bickering, bureaucratic blundering, waste, and political infighting will surely result. There is no natural tendency for big government to enjoy stability without excessive and brute force as was used in the Soviet system. But eventually the natural tendency toward instability as it occurred in the Soviet Empire will bring about NATO's well-deserved demise. NATO, especially since it has embarked on a new and dangerous imperialistic mission, will find using brute force to impose its will on others is doomed to fail. It has been said that in numbers there is strength, but in politics it can also be said that in numbers there is confusion as differences become magnified. Nationalism is alive and well, even within the 19-member NATO group. And when nationalism is non-militaristic, peace-loving, and freedom-oriented, it is a force that will always undermine big government planners, whether found in a Soviet system or a NATO UN system. The smaller the unit of government, the better it is for the welfare of all those who seek only peace and freedom. NATO no longer can hide its true intent behind an anti-communist commitment. Some have wondered how a 60s generation administration could be so prone to war. The 60s were known for their rebellion against the Vietnam War and a preference for lovemaking and drugs over fighting, even communists. In recent months, 4 separate sovereign nations were bombed by the United States. This has to be some kind of a record. Bombing Belgrade on Easter has to tell us something about an administration that is still strangely seen by some as not having the determination to fight a real war. There's a big difference between being anti-war when one's life is at risk as compared to when it's someone else's. That may tell us something about character, but there's more to it than that. Many who were opposed to the Persian Gulf and Vietnam wars are now strongly supporting this so-called just and humanitarian war to punish those who are said to be totally responsible for the Yugoslavian refugee problem. The fact that Serbia is not communist in the sense of North Vietnam may play a part for some in making the decision to support this war, but not the war in Vietnam. But the Persian Gulf War was not at all about communism. It was about oil. Some from the left, if strongly inclined toward internationalism, supported the Persian Gulf War, but for the most part, the opposition came from those who choose not to support a president of the opposite party, while today supporting one's own party's position to bomb the Serbs becomes politically correct. The same can be said of those who are opposed to the Yugoslavian war. Where they supported the Persian Gulf War, this administration has not garnered their support for partisan reasons. The principle of interventionism, constitutionality, and morality have not been applied consistently to each war effort by either political party. And there's a precise reason for this, over and above the petty partisanship of many. The use of government force to mold personal behavior, manipulate the economy, and interfere in the affairs of other nations is an acceptable practice endorsed by nearly everyone in Washington, regardless of party affiliation. Once the principle of government force is acknowledged as legitimate, varying the when and to what degree becomes the only issue. It's okay to fight communists overseas, but not Serbs. It's okay to fight Serbs, but not Arabs. The use of force becomes completely arbitrary and guided by the politicians' good judgment. And when it pleases one group to use constitutional restraint, it does, but forgets about the restraints when it's not convenient. The 60s crowd, although having a reputation for being anti-war due to their position on Vietnam, has never been bashful about its bold authoritarian use of force to mold economic conditions, welfare, housing, medical care, job discrimination, environment, wages, and working conditions, combined with a love for taxes and inflation to pay the bills. When, in general, the principle of government force to mold society is endorsed, using force to punish Serbs is no great leap of faith, and for the interventionists, it's entirely consistent. Likewise, the interventionists who justified unconstitutional fighting in Vietnam, Panama, Nicaragua, Grenada, Libya, and the Persian Gulf, even if they despise the current war in Yugoslavia, can easily justify using government force when it pleases them and their home constituency. Philosophic interventionism is a politician's dream. It allows arbitrary intervention, domestic or international. And when political circumstances demand opposition, it's easy to cite the Constitution, which always and correctly rejects the use of government force except for national self-defense and for the protection of life, liberty, and property. Politicians love interventionism and pragmatism, the prevailing philosophy of our age, a philosophy based on relative ethics. No rigid adherence to law or morality is required. Even the Constitution can be used in this delicate debate of just when and for whom we go to war. The trick is to grab the political, moral high ground while rejecting the entire moral foundation upon which the law rests. Natural rights, rejection of force, and the requirement politicians be strictly bound by a contract for which all of us take an oath to uphold. What does this hodgepodge philosophy here in the Congress mean for the future of peace and prosperity in general, and NATO and the United Nations in particular? Pragmatism cannot prevail. Economically and socially, it breeds instability, bankruptcy, economic turmoil, and factionalism here at home. Internationally, it will lead to the same results. NATO's days are surely numbered. That is the message of the current chaos in Yugoslavia. NATO may hold together in name only for a while, but its effectiveness is gone forever. The U.S. has the right to legally leave NATO with a 1 year's notice. That we ought to do, but we won't. We will continue to allow ourselves to bleed financially and literally for many years to come before it's recognized that governance of diverse people is best done by diverse and small governments, not by a one-world government dependent on the arbitrary use of force, determined by politically correct reasons and manipulated by the powerful financial interests around the world. Our more immediate problem is the financing of the ongoing war in Yugoslavia. On February 9th of this year, I introduced legislation to deny funds to the president to wage war in Yugoslavia. The Congress chose to ignore this suggestion and missed an opportunity to prevent the fiasco now ongoing in Yugoslavia. The president, as so many other presidents have done since World War II, took it upon himself to wage an illegal war against Yugoslavia under NATO's authority. And Congress again chose to do nothing. By ignoring our constitutional responsibility with regards to war power, the Congress implicitly endorsed the president's participation in NATO's illegal war against Yugoslavia. We neither declared war nor told the president to cease and desist. Now we have a third chance, and maybe our last before the war gets out of control. We are being asked to provide all necessary funding for the war. Once we provide funds for the war, the Congress becomes an explicit partner in this ill-conceived NATO-inspired intervention in the civil war of a sovereign nation, making Congress morally and legally culpable. Appropriating funds to pursue this war is not the way to peace. We have been bombing, boycotting, and killing thousands in Iraq for 9 years with no end in sight. We have been in Bosnia for 3 years with no end in sight. And once Congress endorses the war in Yugoslavia with funding, it could take a decade, billions of dollars, and much suffering on both sides before we put it to an end. Bellicosity and jingoism associated with careless and illegal intervention can never replace a policy of peace and friendship whenever possible, and when it isn't, at least neutrality. NATO's aggressive war of destruction and vengeance can only make the situation worse. The sooner we disengage ourselves from this ugly civil war, the better. It's the right thing to do. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas yields back the balance of his time.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman.